You know, I ran for president to deliver the promise of America for all Americans. When I became president, one of the first things I did, I signed an executive order to advance equality and racial justice throughout our federal policies and all our institutions. That's because delivering the promise of America is not the work of one department. It has to be the business of the whole of the federal government. And today, I'm proud to report that more than 90 federal agencies, including every cabinet department, are releasing more than 300 concrete and intentional actions and commitments to address systematic barriers to prosperity, equality, opportunity, and dignity everywhere. You can review it all here at whitehouse.gov/equity. You'll find how agencies are taking ambitious action to protect the wages of hourly workers, eliminate the racial gap in home ownership, increase capital for small business, leverage federal contracting for minority-owned and women-owned small businesses, deliver environmental justice, reduce barriers to transportation, invest in higher education, improve maternal and child health, and so much more. The bottom line, advancing equity is not a one-year project. It's a generational commitment. These plans are an important step forward, reflecting the Biden-Harris administration's work to make the promise of America real for every American. And I mean every American. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this White House convening on equity. I'm Susan Rice, President Biden's domestic policy advisor. I have the responsibility and privilege of driving the president's domestic policy agenda in the White House and across the federal government, from healthcare to economic mobility to rural and urban policy. That includes quarterbacking our efforts to advance equity and racial justice. On President Biden's very first day in office, he signed a historic executive order, making equity and racial justice the business of the entire federal government. That had never been done before. But President Biden and Vice President Harris knew, like so many of us, that it was past time for us to live up to the ideal of equal opportunity at the core of American democracy. They also understood that equity goes to the heart of our success as a nation. When the typical Black family has just 1/8 the wealth of the typical white family, that corrodes our broader economy. When at least 35% of Americans in rural and tribal communities lack adequate high-speed internet that restricts growth and competitiveness well beyond rural America. We must reject a zero-sum mentality and recognize the reality, backed up by economic research, that a rising tide really does lift all boats. For the past 15 months, our administration has been hard at work doing just that. We passed the landmark American Rescue Plan, advancing an equitable response to the pandemic and cutting child poverty to record lows. Through the president's historic bipartisan infrastructure law, we're closing the digital divide, removing poisonous lead pipes, and creating good jobs in underserved communities, both rural and urban. We're working to tackle housing discrimination, to promote environmental justice and defend the sacred right to vote. Today, we're taking another important step towards a more equitable and just future. When President Biden signed that day one executive order, he directed each federal agency to develop an equity action plan, identifying the often invisible barriers that prevent their policies and programs from benefiting all Americans, and coming up with ways to address those obstacles. More than 90 agencies answered that call, from every major cabinet-level agency to smaller entities like the Export-Import Bank and the National Science Foundation. This was truly a whole-of-government endeavor. To learn more about the 300+ concrete strategies and commitments in these action plans, you can visit the new website we've launched today, whitehouse.gov/equity. And you'll hear more from our panelists shortly. But I'll note that the thoroughness and creativity reflected in these plans are impressive. The Pentagon is leveraging its vast procurement power to narrow the racial and gender wealth gaps and support small, disadvantaged businesses. The Environmental Protection Agency is revitalizing its focus on environmental justice for disadvantaged communities, shifting its civil rights enforcement from primarily responding to complaints to proactively initiating reviews. To address the maternal mortality crisis among Black and Native women, the Department of Health and Human Services is working with states to expand Medicaid postpartum coverage for a year after childbirth, a critical period in which nearly 12% of postpartum deaths occur. These plans also embed equity into the day-to-day work of the federal government, from making it easier to fill out forms and navigate websites, to the work our Equitable Data Working Group is doing to use demographic data to make better policy and deliver better results for the American people. Collectively, these equity action plans will grow federal investment and support in communities that have been locked out of opportunity for far too long. Communities of color, tribal and rural communities, LGBTQI+ communities, communities impacted by persistent poverty, people with disabilities, women and girls. This is transformative work, and I want to thank the agency leaders, those with us today and those who aren't, for prioritizing it. And I'm also grateful to the many advocates and stakeholders who consulted with us and pushed us to raise our ambitions. And I especially want to thank our White House team, particularly the staff of the Domestic Policy Council and the Office of Management and Budget, who carefully reviewed and offered detailed guidance on nearly 100 of these plans. Today is a day of progress, but we're not resting on our laurels. As President Biden said a year ago, and I quote, "We need to make equity and justice part of what we do today, tomorrow, and every day." The Biden-Harris administration is going to keep doing the hard, important work, and I have immense optimism that working together, inside and outside of government, we will bring the full promise of America closer for every American. And now it's my great privilege to introduce Shalonda Young, our Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rice. Just yesterday, I joined the ambassador along with the Vice President Harris and members of the Maternal Health Cabinet for a conversation on what this administration is doing on maternal health. That effort may never make the cover of the New York Times, but it will impact moms around this country, for moms of color, for rural moms, for Native American moms, and for their families. We talked about how caring and delivering a child is one of the most significant experiences in any mom's life, something I know a little bit about. People told me having a child was a life-changing event. I did not believe them. I believe them now. But right now, in this country, giving birth and raising a child is a different experience based on a mom's income and her race, her zip code. Her chances of surviving childbirth can be determined based on those factors. And that's what we mean when we talk about equity, because it shouldn't be like that in the United States of America. I want to highlight 3 key areas where OMB is implementing the Biden-Harris agenda to advance equity. OMB is here to be a partner to agencies on advancing equity. We recognize that this is a historic and first-of-its-kind effort, and that means building new muscle and adopting new approaches in the federal government. This requires engaging key stakeholders like you, as well as state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and how to advance equity through the federal government. OMB put out a public report to the president. We've shared resources we collected online, and we created an equity learning community to support agencies as they develop their equity action plans. Last month, we put out the president's fiscal year 2023 budget, and it makes critical investments in equity. There's an entire 11-page fact sheet I won't go over with you today. You can find it online, and we'll certainly hear more from agency leaders here today. But I want to give a few highlights from agencies not represented here today, because this really is a whole of government approach. You heard the president say that. This budget will upgrade drinking water and wastewater infrastructure in communities that are often overlooked. and it proposes $111 million for DOT's Thriving Communities program to help disadvantaged communities advance transformative and climate-friendly infrastructure projects. It will double the maximum Pell Grant Award. These grants help nearly 60% of Black students, almost half of Latino students, and half of Native students put themselves through college. It would also more than double Title I funding to help under-resourced schools, which disproportionately serve students of color. The budget proposes historic new investments in child welfare reforms that will reduce the overrepresentation of children of color in foster care. While 1 in 17 children spend part of their childhood in foster care, that number is 1 in 9 for Black children and 1 in 7 for Native Americans. And this budget will reinvigorate federal civil rights enforcement to support police reform, prosecuting hate crimes, enforcing voting rights, and more. OMB is working to improve the delivery of federal services for all Americans. We're doing this in part by focusing on life experiences, how people actually live their lives. Families should not have to navigate a tangled web of government websites, offices, and phone numbers to access the services they depend on. Parents don't care whether a program is ultimately run by HHS, USDA, Labor, or HUD. They just want to get the help they need for their families. That's why OMB has provided funding and talent from teams like the U.S. Digital Service to support projects focusing on delivering services better for the people that we serve. And just yesterday, we announced that we are taking on the paperwork and long lines and the endless documents that people face when they want to access government programs. Again, this may not make the cover of the New York Times, but it's critically important to people, especially those underserved by their government. This is part of a broader effort led by President Biden to support better customer service to the American people, including communities that are often underserved. All too often, the people who need help the most have the hardest time getting it, and that's what we're looking to change. Achieving equity is a generational undertaking. This is not a problem that can be solved tomorrow, and certainly not in 1 year. But we're committed to doing the work and doing it so that it lasts longer than any of us around this table and these screens are here for. This is ambitious work, and we can't do it alone. We need you. We want to learn from you. So thank you for your partnership. Thank you for pushing us, for holding us accountable, and for being a part of this critical work. I look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Shalonda. I'm excited now to introduce 6 members of the President's Cabinet who today have released equity action plans that are ambitious but achievable. These plans together will advance health equity and economic justice, increase the investments in minority-owned businesses, strengthen the federal government's partnership with tribal nations and rural communities, and improve the diversity and vibrancy of neighborhoods across America. Federal agencies have just completed an historic 1-year journey to comprehensively assess, for the first time ever, how their key policies and programs may perpetuate the systemic barriers that underserved communities face. Sometimes these barriers are the result of exclusionary policies that the federal government actually promoted in decades past. Each of your agencies has announced new commitments to improve outcomes for underserved communities. We'd like to start by hearing from each of you about what equity means as you deliver your agency's mission. How is your agency working to identify and overcome barriers to equity, including past discrimination? And what are 2 key actions you've committed to in the action plans released today? I'd like to turn first to Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice. Appreciate that very kind introduction and for everything you're doing to address equity and inclusion in the Biden-Harris administration. It's an immense pleasure to be on a call with so many folks focused on ensuring every community has a voice in the policies we create. At Interior, we weave equity and inclusion into everything we do, from creating good-paying jobs and a clean energy economy and taking care of our land, air, and waters, to carving a path toward environmental justice and ensuring that underserved communities can access and benefit from their access to nature. Today, I am so proud to join my fellow cabinet secretaries in putting forward our equity action plans. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to addressing racial inequity and understands that past injustices and marginalization contribute to the disparities that we continually see today. Communities of color and poor communities have borne the burdens of environmental injustice, and many times they get left behind when disaster strikes. We have a long road ahead, but our equity action plans are our pledge to right those wrongs. At Interior, we acknowledge that the agency has not always used a lens of equity when accomplishing our mission. Much of America's history is tied to our public lands, but those lands, the jobs they create, the benefits of nature they provide, have not always been accessible to everyone. Our national parks, monuments, wildlife refuges, and other historic and culturally significant areas have played a major role in shaping America's identity. But we heard during listening sessions and through public comments that access to nature and public lands can be challenging for many people. It's something that I experienced firsthand when I would plan trips for my mom, who used a wheelchair for the last part of her life. We would always have to check if there was an elevator or a ramp that we could use, or even if it would be possible to park near an entrance. While we work to expand access to green space, education, and outdoor recreation for Americans living in and around cities and near many of our most iconic parks are located well away from urban centers and are not particularly accessible to many communities of color. We know that some underserved communities are underrepresented as visitors to public lands. This is exacerbated in low-income urban communities and for persons with disabilities. And even if they can get to the visitor center, some folks may face more barriers to exploring because of lack of transportation options on site, cost limitations, or accessibility barriers. And so we have a path ahead. We're investing in urban wildlife refuges and other spaces that are free to everyone. We're working with Secretary Buttigieg and the Department of Transportation to increase bus routes and other public transportation options serving our parks and other public lands. We're also partnering to offer free or low-cost experiences that introduce people to the outdoors and to understand what other limitations underserved communities and people with disabilities face. And whenever we can, we're expanding the universe of voices who can share their perspectives on access to the outdoors. We're making sure that diverse voices are at the decision-making table because we know that unique life experiences can shed light on new opportunities. Through this work and other important steps in our Equity Action Plan, Interior is reinforcing our commitment to fostering diversity and equity in all that we do. I look so forward to hearing from my fellow cabinet secretaries today about the truly inspirational work they're doing to weave equity into the fabric of our government service. And thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you so much, Secretary Haaland. Let's hear next from our Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge. Secretary Fudge, HUD is leading vital work to address the persistent racial gaps in home ownership and to advance the promise of our nation's civil rights laws. What does equity mean for HUD?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice, as well as Director Young. It's a pleasure to be with you all today and my colleagues. Today is certainly an important milestone in delivering on the President's commitment to advance racial equity. For HUD, racial equity is what we do each day in our mission to provide underserved communities with safe, affordable, and stable housing. Racial equity is and must continue to be front and center. I'm proud of the work that our team has done to develop this action plan. Our equity working group included HUD staff from every office, from headquarters to the field, from staff who have worked at HUD for decades to staff who have just arrived. In total, over 100 staff participated in the HUD Equity Working Group. Our challenge was choosing which of our many programs should be the focus on the Equity Action Plan because all of our programs must be examined through a lens of equity and advancing racial justice. HUD chose reducing the racial home ownership gap and improving equity in the delivery of services to people experiencing homelessness. While it is hard to lift up just one area, I admit, I know we have got a lot of ground to cover, so I will highlight here our work on homeownership. As you and the President have previously stated, we must address a history of racial discrimination in federal programs supporting homeownership. It has been more than 50 years since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. Today, the gap between Black and white homeowners is wider than it was in 1968. Given HUD and the Federal Housing Administration's reparative role in supporting first-time home buyers, many of whom are Black and brown, we are doing what we can to address the racial homeownership gap and unlock generational wealth building for those who have been locked out of opportunity for far too long. HUD's Equity Action Plan puts eliminating the racial homeownership gap front and center. For example, many of you saw that in March, we published the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, PAVE, Madam Co-Chair. We published our action plan to combat bias in the housing market. This plan gets to the heart of where someone lives and what someone looks like, impacting their prosperity and wealth. Because the fact is that Black people and Latino people lose billions of dollars in equity and wealth just for being Black and brown. HUD recently announced our new senior advisor for racial equity, who comes to us with vast experience and will help lead this work throughout our agency. Equity is infused throughout what HUD does. We will continue to be on the forefront of this issue, whether executing on the 4 areas highlighted in our plan or in delivering our mission to ensure everyone has an affordable, healthy, safe place to live. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Fudge, for your historic work at HUD. I'd like to turn now to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra. Secretary, one of the places where inequities remain most profound in our nation is in health outcomes and access to health care. Tell us how HHS is advancing equity.
Ambassador Rice, thank you, and good morning to everyone. Let me begin, if I may, by thanking President Biden, Vice President Harris, Ambassador Yu, and the folks at the Domestic Policy Council for continuing to make equity a priority. We at HHS treat advancing equity not just as a job, but our mission here at the department. And we want to make sure that people understand everything we're going to do through our Equity Action Plan to make that a reality. So I'm going to go ahead and mention a few of those things because it is important that people know what we're doing here at HHS. Highlights, well, civil rights has to be part of that. We want to make sure that we're ensuring people's rights to care, that those rights are protected, including the rights of the disability community and LGBTQI Americans. Language access, we want to make sure that regardless of where you came from, what language you speak, you can still get the care that you need. Contracting and grants. We want to make sure that more businesses, organizations, and partners that have built trust in the communities that serve those most in need can be the vehicle for HHS funding and services so that we reach people that need it most. Capacity building. We're going to make sure that we're working to make sure our staff can access and shape programs so that they are best and ready to serve everyone. And finally, special focus on maternal mortality. Because here there's a clear area where we know there are stark disparities in America, the richest country in the world, that can destroy families. Those disparities often leave a child without a mother or a mother without a child. And we know that we can do a great deal, but we know specifically that in certain communities, our Black and our Alaska Native American Indian communities, the suffering is hardest. So we are taking on this challenge to make it a better life for all families. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure equity is always a focus. We know that a service can help people if it reaches them where they are. We're not going to wait for folks to come to us. We're going to go to them to provide them what services we offer. That's why we focused so much of our plan on breaking down barriers and getting services to healthcare services to people in their communities. Maternal mortality will give us a clear way to show that we can make a difference. We know that there are significantly higher rates of death, in some of our particular communities. And so we're really going to zoom in on that as much as we can. So we're going to address this crisis by working with states to extend health insurance coverage in Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program. We're going to make sure we extend postpartum care for a new family from 60 days for that mother and baby to 365 days, a full year of coverage. We have a lot of work to do, we know that, but through these kinds of convenings, through the work and these action plans that we're putting forward, we think we can get it done, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Becerra. Equity entails delivering for all underserved communities and communities that the federal government has, in many respects, left behind, which very much deliberately includes rural America. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, to talk about the many good programs and efforts that USDA has underway in the equity space. Mr. Secretary.
Madam Ambassador, thank you very much for your leadership in this effort. And I want to also acknowledge the work of Director Young and her team at OMB that has allowed us to get to this point today. Look, I think we're all well aware of the history of USDA, which for far too long continued to be one of discrimination, disinvestment, exclusion, and denied opportunity. Efforts were undertaken during the Obama-Biden administration to write a new history for USDA, but President Biden's executive order allows us to continue that effort and to engage in a deeper and more comprehensive effort. And we are looking forward to accepting that challenge. At USDA, we base our equity effort on 4 very significant pillars. The first pillar is the establishment of an equity commission, co-chaired by Dr. Jewel Bernal, the first African-American deputy at the United States Department of Agriculture, and Arturo Rodriguez, former president of the United Farm Workers Union. 15-member commission taking a very specific and very deep dive look at USDA in an effort to try to determine what systemic barriers still exist with reference to our programs and the availability of those programs, and to make recommendations to root out those systemic barriers that do exist. And we look forward to the recommendations from that commission coming this year. The second pillar is an internal commitment at USDA to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. We have the most diverse senior leadership team in the history of the department, and each of those individuals is committed to making USDA a great place to work with a culture that puts equity in front of everything we do at USDA. The third pillar is our program equity pillar, governed by an extensive equity action plans that have been put forward by 20 mission areas within USDA. They've identified 525 specific actions that we intend to hold ourselves accountable in order to advance equity at USDA. Let me establish for the benefit of those who are watching this today, a number of priority areas at USDA where we're going to have a particular focus. We know we have to expand access to our programs, and access requires meaningful access through the establishment of technical assistance grants so that people understand and appreciate where our programs are and how best to apply for them. We've already issued 128 grants to expand technical access to underserved communities and populations. We look to remove barriers to qualifying for participation in our programs. The match requirement oftentimes in our grant programs makes it more difficult for underserved populations to participate. We want to make a fuller use of our nutrition programs, especially our WIC program, where we only have a 50% participation rate, and we know that women of color are disproportionately excluded from this program. We want to expand investment in persistent poverty counties where 21 million Americans live, 60% of whom are people of color. We want to advance the Justice 40 initiative as we do so. We want to use the power of our procurement at USDA to open up opportunities to small and historically underserved businesses that have never been able to do business with USDA. We want to hold ourselves accountable for civil rights compliance, and we want to strengthen our trust and treaty obligations with tribal nations. And the last pillar is, in fact, those last 2 items, civil rights compliance and strengthening our trust and treaty obligations with Native American tribes. We're excited about this opportunity. We are committed to it, and we believe that at the end of the day, USDA will be able to write that new and more progressive chapter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Vilsack. I'd now like to turn it over to Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. Madam Secretary, Commerce has such important influence over the growth of our nation's economy and the health of our businesses. I'd love to hear how Commerce is advancing our equity agenda.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice. It's fantastic for me to be with all of you this morning, and I think it's important that the Commerce Department is included in this discussion, because the truth of it is, inclusive growth is good for our economy. It's not only the right thing to do, but it will spur economic growth, because our diversity is America's competitive advantage. Homogeneity is the enemy of innovation and growth. And if we want to truly, compete on the global stage, then we must give everyone in America an opportunity to participate in the economy and to fulfill their potential and to fully participate. So here at the Commerce Department, I am very focused on driving and enhancing U.S. competitiveness. And in order to do that, it is essential to make sure that our prosperity is broadly shared. And that has not always been the case. So for that reason, I am particularly grateful for the leadership of President Biden, Vice President Harris, Ambassador Rice, Director Young on this issue. I think it couldn't be more important. In recognition of the fact that we at the Commerce Department and we in this administration believe so much in inclusivity, we recently changed the Department of Commerce's mission statement, because I believe firmly that you have to set the tone at the top if you want the work throughout the department to go in the right direction. Previously, our mission statement was, quote, to create the conditions for economic growth and opportunity. Now, as of a month ago, our mission is to create the conditions for economic growth and opportunity for all communities. And that really means all communities. So to that end, we're expanding outreach to ensure that underserved communities benefit from our existing programs. And on top of that, we're also rethinking these programs and our policies to ensure that they meet the needs of underserved and unserved communities. Our Equity Action Plan prioritizes 6 goals. First, and Ambassador Rice mentioned this, first, closing the digital divide through our broadband programs once and for all. Every single American, deserves access to high-speed, affordable internet. Second, ensuring community development dollars advance racial equity and support underserved communities. For too long, they haven't, and it's time to change that. Third, grow minority-owned businesses, and I'll talk in a second about MBDA. Fourth, strengthen small businesses in underserved communities by helping them access export markets. We know that businesses that export grow faster, are more profitable, and hire more. Small businesses, particularly women and minority-owned, don't export. And it's our job to make sure that they do, and they can, and they know how, and have support. Fifth, increasing access to the patent and trademark systems for inventors and entrepreneurs from historically underserved communities. And finally, make the Department of Commerce science and data more findable, accessible, and usable. Today, in the interest of time, I just want to specifically focus on our implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act programs. As you all know, the infrastructure law has sent to the Department of Commerce almost $50 billion in order to close the digital divide by providing every American with broadband. And very soon, in May, in just about a month, we're going to be releasing our big notice of funding opportunity for this initiative. And that means rural households, African-American households, households on tribal lands who are now less likely to have home access to broadband. It's on us to make sure that they have access to broadband. So we're going to be providing states and territories with funds to develop and implement 5-year broadband action plans to close the digital divide. And these plans have to address local and community needs and identify those areas that need to be prioritized for federal broadband investment. And we are deadly serious about this. We are not going to send a penny out the door unless we are convinced that that plan is going to deliver broadband to everybody. Everybody. 50% of people on tribal lands now do not have access to broadband. 30% of people in rural America do not have access to broadband. Shame on us, and let's make sure we change that. Additionally, the infrastructure law permanently authorized the Minority Business Development Agency, MBDA, and we are now making huge progress on our efforts to grow the revenue of minority business enterprises here in the United States. We know that growing minority business enterprises, MBEs, can reduce the racial wealth gap, increase employment and opportunity in majority minority communities, and increase U.S. economic competitiveness. Excitingly, the MBDA is going to issue several funding opportunities in the next month, including one to expand MBDA's business center network to new states. And I'm very excited about this. So our equity plan tackles enormous challenges, and this is challenging work, but it's work that we have to do. And I would just end by saying I feel very grateful to work on a team that cares deeply about this. And as I say, I'm grateful for your leadership, Susan, for leading from the White House. But as I look around this Zoom, I couldn't be luckier. You know, Tom and Deb and I are working on broadband. Secretary Fudge and I are working on affordable housing. We're working very closely with Administrator Guzman on the MBDA work with MBEs, and that's what it's going to take, an entire team, administration-wide approach driven by President Biden, and we will be able to deliver these results to close the equity gap.
Thank you very much, Secretary Raimondo. And finally, let's turn to the Administrator of Small Business, Isabel Guzman, to talk about all that the SBA is doing for historically disadvantaged communities.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice, for your leadership on President Biden and Vice President Harris's equity agenda, which is really a driving force forward, and Director Young as well for lifting equity as a priority. It's a pleasure to be here with my cabinet colleagues as well and to hear about their great initiatives and continue to find ways to partner to lift the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to equity and our work at the SBA. Entrepreneurship, as we know, has long been a pathway for more Americans to achieve generational wealth building. And today, that entrepreneurial spirit is stronger than ever. Thanks to continued support through the American Rescue Plan, we've helped small businesses survive with COVID relief. New business applications are up 30% over pre-pandemic levels, and women and people of color are starting businesses at the highest rate. It's a pivotal moment to finally address the capital gaps and opportunity gaps that hold back too many of our underserved entrepreneurs, who are the majority of these new businesses starting. The SBA is committed to equitably delivering the American dream of business ownership to more Americans. Equity is our North Star, and our core programs address those gaps directly with our small business lending and investments, our support networks, which help businesses level up their skills and gain market access to grow their revenues. And with the Equity Action Plan we're announcing today, the SBA is committing to progress on equity. First and foremost, we know connection is key for success in entrepreneurship, and we are building community partnerships to ensure all of our entrepreneurs are connected to resources. We launched the ARP-supported Community Navigators pilot program, and will be focused on empowering our new trusted, authentic network of 51 hub partners and more than 440 local spoke partners to build bridges to underserved communities, making sure they are connected to our district office centers and program offices across the country. And we will strengthen how we will increase access to this new network. We've elevated our Office of Native American Affairs and our Office of Women's Business Ownership and launched our Council on Underserved Communities that is meeting regularly to address all these policy areas with the SBA. And we're focused on strengthening our Women's Business Center network, which is now the largest network in our agency's history, now in every state in Puerto Rico, and we've doubled the number of centers at HBCUs and MSIs. And we will scale up business counseling, training, and other services to ensure equity and that we are delivering for the changing face of entrepreneurship. Secondly, access to capital is really vital for entrepreneurial success. With Vice President Harris, we announced just a couple of weeks ago an extension and key reforms in our Community Advantage Loan Program, and we will focus on expanding the program, which will help our mission-based lenders, those community development financial institutions and community development corporations, get more flexible capital to underserved small businesses. Expect new CDFIs in our network in the coming months as we grow this important program. And we will further expand access to capital across our entire portfolio, focusing on simple products to meet businesses where they are and with technology and wider distribution networks. The third area is really revenue growth. It's also very key for our small businesses, and we want to open doors, for example, to government contracting, especially growing the supply chain with small disadvantaged businesses, as well as those participating in all of our socioeconomic programs for women, veterans, and socially economically disadvantaged businesses. We recently opened more government contracting opportunities for small businesses, including women and other socioeconomic firms, with a 70% expansion of industries that women-owned small businesses can compete in for sole sourcing, and an expansion of 229 government small business size standards across 16 sectors, including the industries that will leverage opportunities in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So we need to get to work, and we're committed to making sure that contracting opportunities are available to more. We want to ensure that they can all leverage these new opportunities to build revenues within their businesses and expand. And finally, an area that the SBA is committed to participating in is the disaster assistance and support. We're expanding our disaster assistance, emphasizing preparedness, resilience, and mitigation, especially in the face of climate change and its impact on underserved communities. You know, we recognize that there's a lot of work to do across our programs to make sure that we are really truly meeting businesses where they are and in that changing face of entrepreneurship. Some of these changes are made with the stroke of a pen, but others are structural, and we will take more time to implement. But we know that with commitment and the partnerships that we've established and the work that we've done to date, we're going to work to transform our programs for equity in American entrepreneurship. And I really look forward to the continued leadership of President Biden and Vice President Harris as we charge forward on these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for those highlights. I'm extra excited after listening to your many updates to continue the conversation. I have a question for Secretary Fudge and Secretary Becerra. One of the key elements of agency equity action plans has been the recognition that far too many Americans continue to face significant intergenerational poverty. The zip codes we grow up in have a lifelong impact on our health and our economic security. We heard from Secretary Fudge on HUD's commitment to addressing disparities in home ownership, Secretary Becerra, HHS's role in bringing down maternal mortality and morbidity. Can you speak to how your equity action plan specifically ensure that a family's background or the neighborhood someone grew up in doesn't hold them back from achieving what we like to call the American dream, from good health and prosperity?
You want me to start?
Sure.
I'd be happy to. Thank you very much for the question. Our equity action plan addresses and recognizes what many of us already know, that where you live, or conversely, if you have nowhere to live, and that is a growing population in this country, impacts nearly every part of our lives, whether it be our schools that our children attend, the jobs that we have access to, the health care we receive, and the air we breathe, just by where we live. And so we are focused not only on how we address what is happening in neighborhoods, but importantly, how we address homelessness. When we think about the disparity in homelessness, think about it in this way. The population of the United States is about 13% African American, but it's about 50% of the people who sleep on the streets of this country every day. And so our equity action plan is addressing how we deal with homelessness, how we address early in the stages of homelessness, things like pregnancy, children in schools, healthcare. We're doing assessments earlier, and we think that we're making a difference. And so with that, I would turn it to my colleague, Secretary Becerra.
So let me just add, and thank you for the question, Director Young, that for us, we know we had to do a couple of things. First, we had to change the paradigm where people had to come to us in order to get services. We decided we have to go to you because too many folks aren't fully aware of the kind of services and programs that are available to them. So we didn't want to wait. We went to you. And the other thing we realized is we had to collect better data so we would know where you are and who you are that need the help most. And so we established a Minority Health Social Vulnerability Index, which helps us collect data, better data, so good quality data, better collection methodology, so we could actually figure out where we needed to go rather than wait for you to come to us. Secondly, by having better data, we could do a couple of things. Vaccines. A year ago today, by the way, we know that vaccines are killing people of color, Blacks, Latinos, Indigenous people at about 2 times the rate of white Americans. So on vaccines last year, we saw that about 2/3 of white American adults had received at least one shot of the vaccine. That was just barely over 50% for Black Americans and Latinos at that particular time. So again, we got to work. Today, a year later, over 80% of white American adults have received at least one shot. Over 80% of Black American adults have received at least one shot. Over 80% of Latino Americans have received at least one vaccine shot. That's because we went to you and we had better data to tell us. Same time, President Biden made a commitment. We're going to get more people insured so they have access to healthcare and the peace of mind that comes from knowing you can take your child to the hospital and not go bankrupt. What did we find? Well, too many folks in our communities were not getting the care they needed because they weren't getting the insurance they could afford. We went to work. I can tell you that after a successful enrollment period for the Affordable Care Act, where we broke records, we now have 14.5 million Americans who've signed up for health insurance and have peace of mind because of the Affordable Care Act. Well, within that, 35% more Black Americans signed up for a healthcare policy under the Affordable Care Act than just last year. 25% more Latinos signed up for a healthcare plan than did last year. We went to you, we got the good data. That's how you reach people.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn to Secretary Haaland and Secretary Vilsack to talk a bit about how your agency equity plans are addressing the needs of rural and tribal communities, which are central to our mission to advance equity for everybody who's been underserved. So let me begin with Secretary Haaland and then, I'll start with Secretary Vilsack and then to Secretary Haaland, please.
All right. Thanks, Madam Ambassador. Well, first of all, the key here for rural communities is making sure that they know about our programs. For example, the great bipartisan infrastructure bill that President Biden led us to finally getting done. A lot of communities do not know and do not appreciate what may be in that bill for them. So it's really important for us to get the message out about that infrastructure bill as well as the American Rescue Plan. And part of that is providing technical assistance, making sure that people who are trusted are giving individuals in rural communities information. It's also necessary for us to take the benefits of the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure plan to try to provide innovative solutions. We know, for example, in terms of minority producers, that land access and market access are really, really significant challenges. So we're looking at ways in which we can expand local and regional food systems to create new market opportunities. We're looking for creative ways to provide land access. We're expanding processing capacity with the resources under the American Rescue Plan, all designed to create those opportunities for minority producers. I think it's also necessary for us to understand that sometimes communities cannot make the match requirement that many of our grant programs require. So, for example, in our Reconnect program, we basically set aside $350 million for no match opportunities for tribal areas in an effort to try to respond to that concern. The last thing I would say is that sometimes you also have to make sure that you're allowing folks to compete on a level playing field. Far too often, the way we judge applications for grants is based on a point system. If you don't have the points, you don't get the grant. we're leveling the playing field by providing some additional points for areas that have been persistently poor so that they can compete in a more effective basis. And finally, it really takes leadership. Obviously, the President and Vice President's direction to us really allows us to encourage our mission areas to focus on this issue of equity and making sure that people have access to our programs.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Secretary Holland?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rice. And of course, we love working with Secretary Vilsack and the USDA. We appreciate his efforts and those of our team to reach rural communities and ensure that they're included in our collaborative conservation efforts. In fact, I just returned from Colorado, where we highlighted how infrastructure investments in fire mitigation and prevention from President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law will make a transformative and lasting impact on rural communities. When it comes to tribal communities at Interior, we believe that honoring our relationship with tribes and upholding the trust responsibility is paramount to fulfilling our department's mission. And that means valuing and respecting Indigenous knowledge to create a more sustainable future, ensuring Indigenous leadership has a seat at the table to make decisions early on about their communities, making strong investments through the President's bipartisan infrastructure law and proposed budget, and giving Indigenous people opportunities to rise above the challenges that our people face and to build a brighter future for all of our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. I am so proud to be part of this administration, proud to work alongside these amazing cabinet secretaries, and know that it takes that everyone takes this responsibility seriously every day. Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, very much.
All right, let's turn to Administrator Guzman and Secretary Raimondo. One key focus of these equity action plans is on building wealth and economic power for communities of color and other underserved communities. The federal government has enormous purchasing power and the ability to address barriers that families face in building intergenerational wealth. You both covered some of this, but can you drill down further on what your agencies are doing to focus on building wealth for communities that have been locked out of the opportunity to do this for generations? If we could start with Administrator Guzman.
Thank you so much, Director Young. Government procurement, I agree, is where we can put the power of the federal spend to work to advance equity. America's small business industrial base has been declining for more than a decade, with small businesses doing federal contracting dropping by more than 40%, but then new entrants were down more than 60%. And we know from SBA's recently released disaggregated data analysis that small businesses owned by people of color are underrepresented in contracting. So, with the President's leadership, all buying federal agencies are working together to build equity in procurement so that more small, disadvantaged businesses can do business with the world's largest buyer, the U.S. government. Federal agencies are now required to track and publicly report how they're bringing in new contractors. Executive performance metrics with the agencies for small business goals for socioeconomic firms, which include women, veterans, and socially and economically disadvantaged businesses, are now being tracked. And that includes, of course, those small disadvantaged businesses for which the President committed to increasing to the goal to 15% by 2025. With a first-year goal of 11% that agencies are well on their way with, that SBA has had the pleasure of negotiating with all of them. As I mentioned, SBA is reporting disaggregated federal contracting data for the first time, tracking by race and ethnicity. Means we can better track contracting disparities, and we'll continue to focus on how we can make improvements and use it to inform decisions. We've also collectively reformed category management so that small businesses can better access those large bundled contract opportunities, which we know are so challenging. As the agency responsible for directing the federal contracting goals, you should all know that how committed all the agencies are to these goals, especially considering the President's $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure law spend and the commitments of this administration to equity. that is going to go a long way to ensure that we can reverse some of those trends in small business contracting and bring in new contractors and focus on equity. And we know it's going to take quite a bit of support. The SBA has, of course, its network of business opportunity specialists across the nation at our district offices that focus specifically on helping more small businesses through the certification process, learning how to use SAM.gov, or leveraging our experts with intel on contract opportunities, with our procurement center representatives and our commercial market representatives that actually track contracts at the subcontracting level as well to make sure small businesses can participate. And so we're looking forward to this impact and all the agencies collectively making a difference.
Thank you. Secretary Raimondo?
Thank you. By the way, I couldn't ask for a better partner in this work than Administrator Guzman. We're working very closely on this, and I'm grateful for your leadership. So similar to the SBA, we're focused on growing small businesses across the country because most Americans work in small businesses, and it is the way to build wealth for individuals, families, and communities. So, and we have a lot of work to do. In 2019, the gap in business ownership between Black and Latino households relative to white households accounted for 25% of the overall racial wealth gap. So if we could greatly enhance and improve the ability of people of color to create and sustain small businesses, we could eliminate a quarter of the overall racial wealth gap, which would be pretty incredible. And eliminating that persistent racial wealth gap is obviously critical to achieving the long overdue promise of equity and equal opportunity for all Americans. So here at the Commerce Department, as I said earlier, the MBDA, Minority Business Development Agency, is very focused on this. And we are expanding support for procurement in new and existing business centers to ensure that MBEs can actually benefit from the federal government's investments. As Isabel said, it can be hard. It can be hard to do business with us. It's, you need a lot of assistance, technical expertise. Shalanda, no one knows better than you. Sometimes it's a bit too much paperwork, and it's hard for small businesses who don't have a big staff. And so that's why at MBDA, we're very focused on helping and supporting MBEs to know when to apply, how to apply, what their financial statements need to look like in order for them to be eligible and successful. Additionally, in helping with that technical assistance for MBEs for federal procurement, we're also assisting them to increase their exports. As I said earlier, we know companies that export are more profitable, faster growing, and actually quite a bit less likely to go bankrupt. So here at the Commerce Department, we're focused on expanding export assistance to small and medium-sized companies in underserved communities. In this regard, the Commerce Department is well positioned. We have over 100 domestic export offices with dedicated trade professionals to provide market intelligence, counseling, advice, services, technical support to help broaden the export horizons of small businesses. And not surprisingly, women minority-owned businesses have fallen behind in this. And so we are very eager to prioritize this work so that we can, again, close the equity gap. The last quick thing I'll mention is also at the Department of Commerce, through our Economic Development Administration, we are very focused with our ARP money on place-based economic development, money in the community, and we are prioritizing transformational investments in rural communities, communities of color, and geographies that have been historically and systematically denied an opportunity to participate in economic prosperity. So we hope that taken together, all of this work at the Commerce Department will really help ensure that our small businesses, particularly those in underserved communities, have access to the support that they need and deserve, frankly, to survive and thrive.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Let me close by reiterating our thanks to all of you all of our secretaries for your inspiring and historic work that your agencies are undertaking to advance equity and racial justice. The President's commitment to building a cabinet that is historically diverse and truly looks like America is evident in the ways that you and your life stories and personal experiences impact how you're delivering for the American people. The actions that your agencies are taking are just the tip of the iceberg of the hundreds of new strategies that agencies have announced today to advance equity across the whole of the federal government. I hope those of you who are watching have learned a good deal about the great work that all of you and our colleagues who aren't able to be with us today are spearheading, and to learn more in great detail about the work of the federal government to advance the President's whole of government equity EO, I urge you to go to whitehouse.gov/equity, and there you will see in great detail all that our more than 90 agencies are doing. So please stay tuned also for our next panel with national equity advocates and leaders. It'll be a very interesting discussion, and thank you again to all of our secretaries for your extraordinary leadership. And thank you, Shalonda Young, my friend and colleague at the Office of Management and Budget.
Good morning. My name is Chirag Bains, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Deputy Assistant to the President for Racial Justice and Equity at the Domestic Policy Council. As you've heard, on his first day in office, President Biden signed a historic executive order centering equity in the way government delivers its services and programs to communities. No president has ever before issued a comprehensive approach to equity of this scope and scale. Executive Order 13985, Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities through the Federal Government, directed federal agencies to launch an equity and racial justice agenda to match the scale of the challenges that we face as a country, as well as the scale of the opportunities before us. With more than 90 federal agencies releasing their agency action plans today, we are pleased to have the opportunity to engage with a panel of national equity experts. The leaders joining us today and their organizations have done foundational work to advance equity over many years. They have partnered with government, conducted research, launched campaigns, and used their convening power to press for change. They are uniquely positioned to speak to the executive order and the important commitments that agencies have made in those plans, not only to the President of the United States, but to communities across the nation. Let me briefly introduce each of them in alphabetical order. Cindy Benavides is the CEO of the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. Dante Desiderio is CEO of the National Congress of American Indians. Fatima Goss-Graves is the President and CEO of the National Women's Law Center. Glenn Harris is the President of Race Forward. Michael McAfee is the President and CEO of PolicyLink. The Honorable Ayanna Pressley is a member of Congress representing the 7th District of Massachusetts in the House of Representatives. Connie Stewart is the Executive Director of Initiatives at Cal Poly Humboldt and Chief Policy Advisor at the California Center of Rural Policy. Maria Town is the President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. And John Yang is the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Welcome to you all. Let me begin with a question for Michael and Glenn. Michael, PolicyLink, in partnership with movement partners and leaders like Race Forward, has been engaged with several federal departments to support racial equity in planning and in implementation. And Glenn, Race Forward and the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, GARE, have also worked through a broad network with many government offices on equity initiatives. Can each of you highlight a few successes in your work with agencies and government more broadly, and tell us about the ingredients for effective partnerships? What advice do you have for other equity-focused organizations who want to support agencies in implementing their equity action plans? Michael, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you for having me. And Thank you to this administration for doing something that is quite transformative, centering racial equity in this nation. We had a chance to work with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Commerce early on, soon after the Racial Equity Executive Order came out, the Office of Field Policy and Management and Recapitalization with HUD, and generally with Commerce. And we had some great successes in one, leveling up foundationally on the understanding of racial equity. And how do you translate a mission that is already true into an aspiration that there is still more work to do? And so that's the work that we did. We also began to create tools and resources that could be used, especially after today. We put out a document called For Love of Country, A Path to Advance Racial Equity. And that document is available to everyone as a guide that says a couple of things, and this gets us into what we've learned. We've learned that leaders have to have the right vision and the right mindset to do this work. So there's a couple of things. The first is to understand that this is our generational work. This is us stepping into the promise that was in the founding of this nation to continue to perfect it so that we can govern for all. Governing for all is how we will realize the promise of equity in our lifetime. But in addition to that notion of governing for all with a racial equity consciousness, it's important to hold the interest of who do we serve. More than nearly 100 million people in this nation, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, are still economically insecure, 55 million of whom are people of color. This is a results conversation. This is a conversation about the design of this nation. And our job is to think about how do we transform our laws, our customs, and our regulations so that this nation serves everyone. And so when we think about mindset, it's important, and we saw this in the agencies, to think about reckoning with our past. It's hard to craft good strategy and get the results you want when we aren't clear-eyed about our past. But we also have to have a commitment to repair the harms done in our past. And then most importantly, to transform the lives of that 100 million, not just in ways that are charity-oriented, the provision of immediate human relief, but ways that are liberatory, meaning that our laws and regulations and our institutions can see their humanity and serve. And the last thing I'll say here around what we have learned about good partnerships is that we should not be ashamed to be advancing racial equity. There is no shame in loving everyone and wanting to see everyone participate, prosper, and reach their full potential in this nation. And last, the pursuit of equity is about results and accountability. We can no longer continue to expend billions of dollars and not have the indicators of well-being for that 100 million going in the right direction. So these are some of the things that we've learned. Clarity of vision, clarity of mindset, and holding an accountability for making sure that we can answer the most fundamental question: who is actually better off in that 100 million population because of our service? And lastly, government is the scaling vehicle to the transformative change that we want to see. And our jobs as corporate America and civil society is to join hands with the federal government and help them achieve the results that we aspire to, especially by centering racial equity in America.
Thank you, Michael, for that inspiring vision and for focusing us. Glenn, I'd like to turn to you on that question.
Yeah, I just so much to echo on what Michael shared, but I'll start out by just saying thank you. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here today with you all. Race Forward, we've been at the forefront of addressing systemic and structural racism for over 40 years. And for us, we believe it's essential that we create change in our national narrative about race, how we talk about race matters, that we create change in how our institutions literally function, and that we move policy that's specific to addressing systemic racism. And I have to say that, I believe that all three are essential and interlocking. And the great part about today's announcement is that the administration's executive order mandating a sort of whole government approach to racial equity is historic in its ambition to advance all of them. The other thing we know from the work we've been doing is that that this work requires navigating sometimes an overwhelming constellation of challenges. And as a result, it requires long-term commitment, infrastructure, and ongoing investment and growth. And we know this from experience. You had named that Race Forward houses the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And we've been working with over 430 jurisdictions across the country, steadily working to advance racial equity at the local and state level since our first program founded in Seattle in 2004. And thanks to the administration's commitment, we have also more recently launched the Federal Initiative on Race and Equity and had a chance to work with HUD and engage with other agencies on how to bring that sort of rich history of local experience of care to the federal level. And albeit challenges, no doubt, are steep, and it can stir up, as we all know, what seems like ceaseless political turbulence, the dividends are almost incalculable. Racial equity is not realized by waiting until the time is right. We've got to push forward until the time is right, and then we got to keep pushing. And I think in a similar manner, I just wanted to name that President Biden has reminded us that democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have to defend it, fight for it, strengthen it, and renew it. And the fight for racial justice is part and parcel of that fight for democracy. We can't have one without the other. Racial equity and justice are literally the cornerstones of a vibrant racial justice democracy. And in fact, the distance between our current reality and that just, vibrant, multiracial democracy is a distance that we see racial equity practitioners in government literally trying to traverse every day. And it's that distance that the release of these equity plans, we believe, can help close. It can actually support folks who actually have both the vision, the skills, and the knowledge to set them free, to actually take those actions, implement that body of work within the agencies themselves. And I'll just end by saying we're deeply committed to working with agencies and community to ensure that the aspirations of the equity plans are actually met.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you both for focusing us on the vision, the mindset, the skills that are necessary to do this work. Representative Presley, I'd like to turn the next question to you. Advancing equity requires institutionalized change. I think that's what Michael and Glenn were talking about. And indeed, it is the heart of the President's Day One Equity Directive to the agencies. The agency plans announced and released today include commitments to executive actions in this vein, such as rulemaking and allocating more resources to civil rights offices. Legislation is also crucial for long-term change. What are the most crucial actions that Congress can take to support the commitments that agencies have made in their action plans and to strengthen the ability of agencies to produce greater equity for underserved communities across the country?
That's right. I really appreciate your framing here, Chirag. The commitments rolled out here today are historic. And so before I get into a more strident response to your question, I just want to say it's important that we take a moment in the midst of our continued struggle for progress and equity to really acknowledge these meaningful wins along the way. It matters deeply that President Biden and Vice President Harris are in the White House. It matters that in the White House and across agencies, we have diverse staff calling the question, pushing the conversation, and moreover, tasked with implementing these plans. So who is at the table matters. And to your point, this esteemed panel and this event is not about declaring mission accomplished. It is about furthering and advancing the conversation and the work. You asked specifically what legislative efforts we continue to advance this agenda. Just as the administration has taken a whole of government approach, Congress must take a wide-reaching approach. And these equity plans and the underlying data collected to develop them must be shared with Congress to continue our meaningful partnership. Now, I serve on the Oversight and Reform Committee, and in that capacity, the chairwoman and I have been working with the administration on implementing the President's Day One executive order. We also want to ensure this executive order on advancing racial equity through agencies is not limited to one administration. The work that Ambassador Rice, Director Young, yourself, and others are doing to remove systemic barriers to federal resources and to provide equal access to underserved communities is valuable work that Congress must codify and continue. I appreciate the truth-telling that has taken place throughout today, because the fact of the matter is that we have literally written inequity into our laws. We have codified that. And so we have an opportunity here to right the course here and to quite literally write equity into law, and we must. And so my approach as a lawmaker continues to be that we must use this powerful governing moment to exact lasting change. And so that means advancing economic justice policy with a racial justice lens and a disability justice lens. Everything from the way we address contracting and procurement to putting forward long overdue high impact policies that redefine folks' relationship with government. Chirag, some people think that widespread practices that shape the contours of the lives of Black and Brown families for generations, like redlining and discriminatory drug charges, were happenstance. And again, I appreciate the truth telling that's taken place throughout today here. No, the federal government played a precise role. And so now we have a chance to use that same attention to detail and precision to heal, empower, and advance. And these issues are connected. And we can use the power of the pen to shape a Federal Reserve that prioritizes full employment and legislative proposals like my federal job guarantee that will get us there. We can shape an SBA that always asks, what does this mean for small Black business as the starting point, just like my Saving Our Streets Act with the former Senator and now our Vice President Harris does. We can collect data to drive our policymaking when it comes to disparate impacts of long COVID on our communities of color, and direct HHS to take cues from disability justice leaders and scale up accessible care in hard-hit communities. And we can legislate wealth building that addresses racial disparities, like my baby bonds bill with Senator Booker. Policy is my love language. So I could go on for an hour about this, but in summary, we should approach each policy conversation as an opportunity to advance racial justice and equity, and the legislative proposals are waiting, they are ready, shovel ready, and so I'm grateful to have partners in the White House to continue to press for progress.
Thank you, Representative Presley. Well, there's a lot of people here speaking your language. We're all policy nerds here, and that is actually the business of making equity real. It is baking it into the policymaking. Thank you for focusing us on the need to acknowledge how prior government practice has been inequitable and what we can do to root out inequity and truly deliver for all Americans. Maria, Dante, Fatima, and Connie, I'll turn to you next. The Equity EO calls for all agencies to engage with stakeholders and communities, especially those who have been historically excluded from government programs, services, and benefits, as Representative Presley was just saying. That includes people with disabilities, it includes LGBTQI+ individuals, rural communities, women and girls, and others who have been locked out of opportunity for too long. As agencies move forward with their action plans, how can they best ensure that federal policy development is truly responsive to the lived experience and the needs of these various communities? Maria, I'll start with you.
Thank you for that question, Chirag, and thank you to everyone who has helped get to this point today, both my federal colleagues and my movement colleagues. Part of moving forward, as so many have said this morning, requires looking back and recognizing that the history of many government programs and services is a history of exclusion and marginalization. Earnest and impactful government community engagement efforts must reckon with an attempt to heal the harms that government has created. When federal policy has not attempted to be responsive to the lived experiences of historically marginalized people, our lives still have been indelibly shaped by it, for better and for worse. So what can this look like in practice? Government community engagement efforts must prioritize accessibility and inclusion from the very beginning of their planning. People with disabilities will not expect federal policy to be responsive of our lived experiences if we have no way to share them. An example, structuring engagements from the start with multiple language and information format offerings, everything from Mandarin to American Sign Language, printed communications to Braille. Another example, providing both remote and in-person opportunities for engagement, as well as asynchronous and real-time opportunities for engagement. Accessibility options need to be advertised boldly so that individuals know it will be safe and possible for them to contribute. Something that I hear from federal agencies, from program offices often, is that they would love to engage more disabled people, but they just can't find them, so the disability community must not be interested or impacted. Let me be clear. If disabled people are not a part of your efforts, it's because we have not been given the evidence that the engagement will be accessible to us or prioritize us. For the disabled people who show up to submit comments or go to a meeting, it's likely that we have had to navigate additional burdens of arranging accommodations or spending hours on a website trying to find alternative formats. We have to stop putting the burden of access on people with disabilities. And further, accessibility and inclusion resources need to be embedded within all engagement activities, not solely for efforts that are specifically focused on the disability community. Disabled people exist in every single community. Our identities do not exist in silos. Federal policy and community engagement that seeks to be responsive to the lived experiences of all of our communities must center this reality and must use every tool available to do so, whether it be its ability to operate as a model employer of an increasingly diverse workforce or its contracting authority to support minority and disabled-owned businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Dante, over to you.
Hi, good morning. I want to start by saying I'm a citizen of the Manapasa Sapana, place of the people of Sepoy. And thank you for the honor of being able to represent our sovereign nations and our native people. And I really like the question, understanding our people, or as the question poses, understanding our lived experience today. It's absolutely vital in creating good federal policy. But I want to pick up too on what Maria had mentioned. I think it's worth taking a moment to show the contrast of bad federal policy to be able to articulate what good federal policy is. So in our communities, our people, the federal government, and before that, the colonial governments, have spent the past 4 centuries practicing bad and, as we can attest, effective federal policy on American Indians by taking lands, taking lifeways, taking culture, taking lives, which, by the way, was celebrated in our nation's capital with the name of its football team only up to a few years ago. And up until the 60s, the federal government was trying to take away our ability to even remain as governments through a policy of termination, terminating our people and terminating our governments as an identity. And we should not think that the taking has stopped. It's worth reminding people that the Supreme Court this session is going to rule on whether it's okay to continue to take our children away from us and away from their culture. So with that context in mind about the effectiveness of bad federal policy and our lived experience, I would propose the first thing that we do as federal government is stop any practice that negatively impacts our communities and be proactive on positive policies that make a real difference. Besides the policy of taking or looking at that as impacting our lived experiences, there's 3 other things I just wanted to mention here. One is on the funding. If we're going to have a conversation about equity and looking at our lived experiences, the funding matters. This nation puts its values every year into a budget. And when we look at that, I just want to give one example on equity. Healthcare is funded for Native people at half the rate of Medicare, Medicaid, and veterans care. So our people are to understand that our health outcomes and our health is half as valuable as the rest of the nation. So that funding matters, and this administration is already taking steps to make that mandatory and already taking steps to increase the funding. So we're incredibly appreciative of that. But we need more, and we need to understand the context of the problem to make a real difference of 4 centuries of bad federal practice. The same can be said for education and for housing. We have a 50-year waiting list for building a new school. Can you imagine that? Someone telling you to wait 50 years before we can get another school that, from the school that is already in poor condition. The other practices or the policies are self-determination. In a really positive step, this administration has looked at our role as governments in carrying out what we think is effective for our people. The ARPA, or the COVID relief, really made a difference for our people to be able to handle what was needed in our own communities and make those decisions. The other issue here in looking at this self-determination, since we're on federal lands and really don't have an adequate tax base, these matching requirements in the federal government really have to go. Our tribes that are in some of the most challenging positions don't have the ability to raise that capital. And then the last thing I want to say is just about this conversation. Understanding our lived experience is absolutely necessary. This administration has done 200 consultations since President Biden has been in place. That's 200 opportunities for us to educate the federal government on policies that can be effective. We're hoping that makes a difference on how these things are carried out. We also have advisory committees that are being set up in agencies to understand that. We start over every administration and start educating on what our governments need, and it's completely ineffective. So how do we carry that forward? How do we get agencies to continue to understand? So the idea of fixing bad federal policies that have occurred over the past 4 centuries, it won't happen overnight. And sometimes it feels like we're getting buckets to fill up a swimming pool. So we need to have context, we need to understand the problems, and we need to move pretty strongly to fix centuries of inequity. And the conversation this morning shows the commitment of the administration to move toward the good and that reassurance that we're being seen and heard. So thank you for inviting us and being able to make conversations that hopefully will impact how we carry this out.
Thank you, Dante. A lot of consistent themes there also with what Maria said about the importance of taking the burden on the federal government, not putting it on those that we're trying to assist and lift up, and in particular with regard to tribes, relating to tribes in a nation-to-nation way has been a priority for this administration to the point of self-determination and sovereignty, and appreciate you recognizing that, Dante. I do think it's making a difference, and we have a lot of work ahead. Fatima, I'd love to turn this question to you.
Thanks so much, Chirag. And I should begin by saying that I think it's really exciting and historic that each agency is taking the steps of asking the basic question of how to make the focus of equity real, intangible in people's lives. And I really want to echo my colleague's call that this work doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's work that's forward-looking, but it has to have and come in an important context that many inequitable conditions came from formal government decisions over time. And I also want to name that I was really pleased, though, to see embedded in these plans meaningful opportunities to ensure that there are policy feedback loops and that there's opportunity and efforts in an ongoing way to reach people on the ground. For example, when I think about what the needs now are of women in this country who've left the workforce, we know that women were more likely than men to work in fields that put them as essential workers on the front lines of the pandemic, more true for Black women and Latino women, but we also know that they were more likely to have lost jobs or left the labor force. And so taking an equity approach will ensure that the Department of Labor's plans around workforce training are meaningfully felt, or their plans around wage and hour are meaningfully felt. And I was really glad to see embedded that the Department of Labor would develop strategic partnerships with community-based organizations and worker centers and unions and conduct equity-focused outreach to essential workers, definitely at a different scale. But when we launched the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund at the National Women's Law Center, we really understood that we needed to meet workers who were really hard to reach, workers who were speaking languages other than English, workers who were in jobs that didn't make it possible to call us during standard hours. And that when people are trying to come forward with either experiences of discrimination or other violations of the law, including things like wage theft, the fear of retaliation is so real. So working with community groups to help people navigate what might seem like intimidating systems can really make a difference in ensuring that the goals are met. And I also think it requires meeting in community over time. And I'm so glad that the front end of this process included so much deep engagement. When I think about some of the plans around, for example, addressing maternal mortality, it is exciting to see concrete plans in place. And in an ongoing way, I hope that the work will continue to engage with community groups, both groups in health centers and outside of it, to help government think about holistic strategies that can make a difference. And I think that's going to be even more important as an even greater public health crisis is on the cusp, as states are on purposely creating it by taking aggressive measures to ban access to abortion care. And then the last thing that I just want to say is that I hope that as you track the effectiveness of this over time, that you're thinking both quantitatively and qualitatively. There is so much potential to actually hear how these plans will be experienced by people as you're making your own assessments about the job that you are doing. That's going to be always all the more true when you're talking about people who have less access, especially young people, who have so many experiences and are thinking now so boldly about equity that it's really inspiring to all of us. So I'm excited about the work ahead and happy to be a part of it.
Thank you, Fatima. I appreciate your points about going to where the expertise is. It is in community to understand how people are experiencing government and the barriers to services. Thank you for focusing us on that. We look forward to partnering with you on holding ourselves accountable to these commitments. Connie, there's a history of disinvestment in rural communities. It's part of the equity agenda. It is a major priority. I'd love to hear from you about your views on this question, about really understanding what is needed in rural communities and how to help.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And I'm so hopeful and so excited. And I have a lot of reading to do over the weekend. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the steps that are being taken. And especially, the targeted action portions of this and the measures of progress in these equity plans. On my first week of work at the California Center for Rural Policy, I received a call from a tribal leader in our county's most remote area. And she told me about a federal grant program that the county received funding year after year for, that her tribe really needed services and support from. But no services were ever delivered to them because of the distance it took to provide those services from the county's urban area. And here's what she said that still haunts me to this day. The county will always qualify for this grant if they don't help our people. And they can keep getting it and delivering services in the urban area. And helping to change programs from being successful like that to making sure they handle the neediest regions and are benefiting those by doing things by thinking differently about who fiscal agents are and how to build capacity in those remote areas is critical. Please, let's not count on existing grantees to deliver services differently to meet equity goals. Geography matters. Let's build capacity in those communities. Let me share an urgent need we have right now. Rural communities are really excited to help the nation with its clean energy goals. But we need to make sure that we get the benefits of that clean energy, we get the quality jobs, and we get the supply chain that comes around with this historic opportunity. Helping us guarantee equitable community benefit plans for both the government and the industry partners that are coming in for this will allow communities, and especially historically excluded people in those communities, to benefit from that clean energy and help us develop the career educational pathways in our communities to get those jobs. A lot of those jobs, training, some people are having to drive 4 or 8 hours or move away from home in order to be able to come back and work in those communities. So help us work with labor to build training centers closer to those future jobs. I was so excited to hear Secretary Vilsack talk about changes in the grant review program at USDA. And I just want to say it costs about $8,000 to write a federal grant. So efforts to make grant writing more affordable would be very helpful, because otherwise we're writing grants that sometimes we don't successfully get, and we're actually removing money from communities in need who are spending a lot of money on writing grants. So once again, that's also a need helping us build capacity to be successful with our partnerships. And finally, I know I speak for all rural practitioners, that we are really looking forward to working with the administration and Congress on these equity plans, and that this is generational work. And there's a lot of need out there in rural. There's place equity, there's racial equity, there's class equity. All of these matter. And we really want to work with everyone in partnership on meeting these needs. So thank you again so much for this opportunity. And I look forward to working with everyone in the future.
Thank you, Connie, for those incredibly important points. And it gives me the opportunity to talk about the importance of the implementation of the President's bipartisan infrastructure law, historic funding that can help underserved communities across the country, and speaks directly to the need to improve job training, make sure people get jobs who've been locked out of them, and expanding capacity to access government funds as well. So thank you for that point. John and Cindy, I'd like to turn to you next. Let's talk about data. Your constituencies have been advocates for equitable data. Better demographic data can offer insight into government programs, benefits, and services, and whether they are reaching the communities that need them, that is, all communities. Many equity plans that were released today include new equitable data initiatives. For example, the census has launched a new Data for Equity webpage and is releasing a new data set that will help identify who is most impacted by droughts, forest fires, and other harms. The VA is launching a new Data for Equity strategy to help ensure that all veterans are benefiting from its services. And there are other examples in the plans. Can each of you speak to the importance of disaggregated data for AA and HPI communities and for Latino communities, and offer your recommendations about how agencies can work with organizations and groups to make sure that they have the granular data that is needed to identify and fill gaps in services while addressing concerns about privacy and the appropriate use of data? John, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Chirag, and thank you to you and the Biden administration for really this important milestone on our journey towards equity and inclusion. Look, disaggregated data or granular data cannot be underestimated when we're talking about how do we build equity. When you're talking about the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, we're talking about over 50 different nationalities, over 100 different languages that have to be covered. One of the problems with our community is that people often regard us as homogenous and fall into what's called that model minority myth. This notion that Asian Americans are by and large doing well, that we don't have needs. But if you disaggregate that data, you look at the specific communities, the needs of a Bhutanese American refugee are very different than the needs of a Korean American student or scientist, or the needs of a Samoan person in agriculture. And so we have to understand all of these individual communities. But you're right, the problem is how do you get that data? We understand that agencies oftentimes look to our communities to get that data. But here's where there's a catch-22, and there's two issues that we need to address. One is capacity. Getting this data, frankly, is costly, especially at this granular level that we're talking about. And especially if we're talking about getting that data in language, reaching people where they are. Many of our community organizations simply don't have those sorts of resources. Literally it's hundreds of thousands of dollars to conduct those surveys, those studies that are necessary to understand the needs. But it is a catch-22 because agencies ask us, well, what are the needs? And then we can help fund it. But then we say, well, we're not sure. We can't give you a scientifically sound survey of what those needs are. We can give you anecdotes of what we are seeing on the ground. And so that's where the push and pull has to come from, is how do we develop the data together? The second issue is that of privacy. If you look at our communities, our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community is in many ways largely immigrant. And so anytime the government comes asking data from us, oftentimes we have a concern. whether it is about immigration status, whether it is about law enforcement, that would cause us to push back and not want to respond to those types of surveys. You have to understand, especially as immigrants coming from governments where government surveillance is seen as a very bad, negative thing, we have to establish trust in the community. And again, that's where the government has to work together with the communities to really establish that trust at that granular level so that we can get that granular type of information that we really need to help all of our communities. So there's a lot of work to be done together, but this work is too important not to get it right. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, John. We appreciate those points. Cindy, over to you.
I appreciate the question, Chirag, and thank you. Muchísimas gracias to the Biden administration for your leadership in advancing equity. Data matters. Representation in data matters. And we know that data can drive policy. We know that technology has brought mixed blessings, but one of them has been big data, and it can and should be used for good. For our community, the largest minority in the US at 60 million strong as of 2019, disaggregated data is crucial because, like our community, what we need from government is not homogeneous. A middle-class Latino family in the Miami suburbs who are English dominant might look very different from an indigenous agricultural worker originally from Mexico and rural California who primarily speak native indigenous languages. The needs of a Puerto Rican family in the Bronx are different than those of a Puerto Rican family in a rural town in Texas. But what LULAC has seen is that regardless of how much makes us different, there's more that brings us together. And yes, we celebrate a common culture, but unfortunately those commonalities are often based on the systemic discrimination that we all suffer in this country. And that is the story that this aggregate data can tell us: when, where, and how our communities are most vulnerable and what are their immediate needs. And let me give you one example. In December, the SBA disaggregated contracting data. Why this matters is because now we know that only 1.78% of federal contracting is going to Latino-owned small businesses, and only 1.67% is going to Black-owned small businesses. What this makes very clear is that we have a starting point, and we can now track economic opportunity disparities. But getting this information, as John alluded, is very challenging, and there is a mistrust of government. And I just want us to remember what we have seen from previous administrations, like the infamous family separation program. Other major challenges is the issue of privacy, language access, and immigration status. The undocumented or mixed status families are least likely to share data with government officials. And the only way to bridge this trust gap is for the government to continue to work with organizations and groups to be able to get that granular data and identify those gaps in services. Community organizations like LULAC and so many others are working hand in hand. And part of it is that our volunteer members live in these communities. People in the neighborhood know who we are, where to find us, and see us working every day to bring positive change locally. We can also help in a very cultural appropriate way to make sure that the public servants' announcements is getting to the people that need it most. And I just want us to remember what we have seen during the pandemic. We were proud to support HHS through vaccine efforts through Vacúnate Hoy and Yo Me Apunto. And we know that when you are tailoring that message, we were working specifically with our meatpacking workers, we could create a difference. We also know that in working with the federal government, it could mean the difference between life or death, as we have seen in this pandemic. For us at LULAC, we know it's important that we continue to work with the government as a trusted partner. We want to be there. And we know that with granular data, we are able to get far ahead of where we have been.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, John, for those vivid examples, for focusing us on the stakes of what we're confronting. We can't begin to solve these problems without fully understanding them, and we are committed to working with you to break through that catch-22, building the trust and making sure we have the data that we need. This last question is addressed to all the panelists, and I want to acknowledge that Representative Presley was called away. So for the other panelists, though, I do want to get your thoughts on this. More than 90 federal agencies released equity action plans today. I started with that. Their goal is to serve the country more equitably. Interestingly, although small independent federal agencies were not legally required to issue action plans by the executive order, more than 50 of them decided to do so because they understood the importance and the value of integrating an equity lens into their work to improve their mission delivery. Advancing equity and addressing systemic injustice, as we've said several times today, is not a one-year project. It's a generational commitment that will require sustained leadership and partnership with impacted communities. And these plans are an important step in that process. As movement leaders, policymakers, leaders of equity-based initiatives, what is the call to action that you would make to communities, to the private sector, to colleges and universities, and to social enterprise organizations in support of this work? I will start, I'll go down the list here. Michael, I'll start with you.
I would say the call to action has to be that we are advancing a racial equity governing agenda. Equity is about governing. That's why I said it is the North Star of governance. So this can't just be initiatives. It has to be the core to what we do. The second is our government, corporate America, and civil society, we must stop undercutting our own results. We can't hold a hostile disposition towards that 100 million. We can't, on one hand, enact programs and policies and procedures that are designed to move folks into the middle class and beyond, and then undercut them with the design of many of the things you've heard my colleagues describe today that are oppressive. We have to stop the harm. You heard Dante signal that. We have to stop taking. So the call to action is for us, all of us, to hold the interest and the aspiration of our ancestors. Let's hold their voice, their wisdom and experience, and think about what it would mean if we just stopped the harm first. And then if we thought about what would it look like to increase the capacity of all of our institutions to serve more effectively. That's the standard now. Accountability for improving the life outcomes of that 100 million. So that's the call to action here. Individually, in our roles, and in our organizations, to stop the harm, and then begin to get methodical about selecting an indicator of progress and being fanatical about getting it going in the right direction.
Thank you, Michael. Dante, your views.
Well, I don't know if I can say it better than Michael, it's really remarkable to hear that sort of summary. It's been on our minds. I think the call to action for us is that we cannot go back. We can't go backwards. So these conversations are setting the foundation, the engagement of the administration, and also, honoring the self-determination. We talked about the government-to-government relationship. The call to action for our community is we can't go back. We are not gonna go back anymore. So this is going to be used as a pivotal moment for engagement with agencies and hopefully opening things up for that, leaning towards the good.
Thank you, Dante. Cindy, what are your thoughts?
And make sure that I unmute myself. Well, first and foremost, I appreciate the acknowledgement that advancing equity and addressing systemic injustice is not a one-year project. It's a generational commitment. And I want to reference the US Constitution, which starts by stating, we the people, nosotros la gente, nosotros el pueblo. Our country is over 245 years old. And as a country, we're just now holding government accountable to the failed promise of we the people, because it hasn't always included non-white people and women. You see, we the people means all of us, and our call to action to the federal government and to the private sector is the following. Representation matters. We have been denied a seat at the table and even persecuted and denied our basic constitutional rights. Now is the time to right past wrongs. It's crucial that those who serve in key positions to influence outcomes be inclusive of all the people, and that the people impacted be included in all the equity working groups and the agencies to ensure that solutions brought to the table are from our own lived experiences. Equity and diversity must in fact include all the people it serves and who contribute every single day to our United States of America. Gracias.
Thank you, Cindy. Glenn.
I've just been so deeply appreciating all of these calls to action. I think what I would add, you named it, the 50 of the agencies, smaller agencies who joined, didn't have to. And I think it's so important that we remember, because the noise around issues of race and equity can sometimes be pretty deafening. But the truth is the overwhelming majority of people in this country believe in those ideas. There's those of us who try to convince us otherwise, but it's not true. The biggest challenge that we have in this moment is not a values gap, it's a skills gap. It's the ability to meet our aspirations. And so I think in that way, for me, as I think about what the call to action is, I would echo other folks. It doesn't matter where you sit. Doesn't matter if you're in the private sector, doesn't matter if you're in the public sector, doesn't matter if you are a community leader, it doesn't matter whether you're in philanthropy or academia. You have the power and voice to center race and equity in this moment. And even more importantly, this last piece that I would add, that deeply believe that as much as we're talking about federal change, all of us know that at the end of the day, real change has always occurred locally. Civil rights movement wasn't a national movement, it was a movement in Birmingham. And so my call to action really is, if you're engaged locally, pull some other folks in and talk to them about what federal accountability on these issues. If you're not engaged, find some folks to get engaged with. If your organization, the place you work, the place you worship isn't engaged, ask them to step up. And the last thing I'd put out is we have a website called racialequityhere.org. And the point of it is just allow folks to find each other who share our values and to be able to see ourselves in space together so that we can take collective action, so we can get the best for our local communities while demanding what we all deserve from the federal government.
Thank you, Glenn. Maria, what are your thoughts?
So one of the outcomes of equity work is that there are a greater multitude of perspectives at the table and making decisions. And this is absolutely vital. And what it comes with are additional critiques and challenges that organizational leaders may not have been held to account about before. They may not have had to address them before. And as our world shifts, whether that's due to disasters and emergencies like COVID or life-altering technologies, the ways that systemic injustice shows up will change. And what it needs to advance equity will need to evolve. It may be tempting in the face of these critiques and challenges to point to an action plan and say, but look at what we've done. Look at what we've committed to. And my call to action is for all of you to resist that temptation. Recognize that our work is never done, that all answers are not known, but through leading with humility, using these challenges and critiques to reflect, learn, iterate solutions, and establish partnerships, we can further those answers that will help sustain a future where everyone thrives and can live with dignity.
Thank you, Maria. As the president has said many times, great nations are not afraid to confront their history. And I hear that in what you're saying as well. Connie, what call to action would you make?
Well, I am very aware I sit at one of those universities that has a call. And I'm also very aware that I wasn't born in one of the zip codes that we've been discussing today. And so what my challenge would be we're still in COVID, but as we come out of COVID, to challenge people to get out to these zip codes and not just talk to intermediaries like me, but go to the coffee shop, go to the post office and sit there for a few hours and talk to that 100 million people we're talking about and hear their stories and then challenge those of us who are intermediaries to make sure that we're on target and that we're not socially engineering communities. That's not how you bring equity to. You need to listen to the people and make us do it, and let's do it together so that we're really helping people with their needs, what's foremost in their minds and foremost for their families. So let's put some money in the travel budget and let's get to these zip codes.
Thank you, Connie, and the administration is going to do its part in that regard as well. You're going to see administration officials out in rural America and all over the country in increasing numbers. John, would love your thoughts on this question.
Sure, I guess I have two quick thoughts. First is, I think now we have a roadmap on this journey, and I purposely call it a journey because it is a journey for which we are all explorers. I appreciate what Maria is saying, is that we must recognize that what we have is a roadmap, and now we have to do the hard work of actually walking in those steps that have been dictated by that roadmap. But unlike a static roadmap, we are also explorers. And so as we go down this map, we will see that we will have barriers. We will have places where there's a valley that we didn't expect or a mountain that we didn't expect that we had to climb. And so we have to adapt to all of that and recognize that there's a goal, but that journey is going to be long. The second is that this is the most audacious DEI plan, if you will, diversity, equity, and inclusion plan that we have seen. The United States government is the largest employer, over 2 million employees. The constituency, the customers are over 330 million Americans, right? Plus everyone that looks at the United States as the center of democracy. And so we have to recognize how audacious, but wonderfully audacious this is. But how you make that live is to also embed that within the civil servants of the federal government. It has to outlive all of us. So how do we make sure that this plan gets embedded into the federal system, into our communities, so that even when we go on to our next chapter, our next journey, that there are others that are willing to continue that journey for us.
Thank you, John. I appreciate those words. I think we may have lost Fatima due to being a little bit over the time here. Deeply appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for joining us to mark this historic occasion of the federal government releasing these 90 action plans, 300 plus actions across the agencies. This is a big deal. You have been part of it. Thank you for your partnership. We are moving forward together, not backward. And I encourage everyone to revisit this broadcast. It will remain on the White House YouTube channel for you to share with your stakeholders and your partners. We invite everyone in our audience to visit the new White House Equity website, whitehouse.gov/equity. We invite your engagement and partnership and the engagement of communities and organizations across the country as we build on the work of this historic executive order. Thank you very much.